call anybody. Call the police. Call me. Call in-laws. Call someone. If you see her, tell me.
Detectives step into the garage. A foul smell lingers in the air. The freezer creaks open, and inside, they find something no one in this quiet Michigan town could have imagined. Cut to the dead of winter. A man stumbles barefoot through the snow, breath sharp, footsteps frantic. The same man who once vowed to protect his wife is now running from the law. This wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It was betrayal. Born inside the walls of his own home. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, I want to know something from you. Go down to the comments and tell me two things. Where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now as you're listening to this story. It's always fascinating to see how true crime brings people together from every corner of the globe at every hour of the day. I'll be reading through them, so don't be shy. And while you're at it, if you find this story gripping, consider hitting like, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe for more in-depth, narrative-driven documentaries. Your support helps bring these stories to life and keeps the memory of victims alive. In the quiet neighborhoods of Macomb County, Michigan, Tara Lynn Grant lived what many would call the suburban dream. 34 years old. A devoted mother of 2 young children. And a career woman with a sharp mind and relentless ambition. She moved through her days with purpose. Every decision carefully measured. Every interaction guided by love for her family. To outsiders, Tara's life seemed seamless. She was organized, driven, and endlessly patient. But those closest to her noticed something extraordinary. She carried herself with a determination that set her apart. Colleagues described her as meticulous, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent. She often stayed late at the office, attended conferences across the state, and yet, she never missed a school event, a birthday, or a moment her children needed her. Neighbors remember her differently, for her kindness, for her willingness to lend a hand. The woman who waved from her driveway, who baked cookies for school events, who would stop mid-walk to chat with a new neighbor. Tara had a warmth that drew people in, a presence that made even the simplest interactions memorable. At home, Stephen Grant maintained the outward image of the supportive husband. He cared for the children, handled household tasks, and spoke proudly of Tara's successes. But those who knew them intimately began to notice subtle tensions beneath the surface. There were moments where his calm demeanor cracked, revealing irritation. Times when he seemed uncomfortable with Tara's independence. A fleeting look, a whispered comment, small gestures that suggested a growing dissatisfaction. Tara, focused on building a life she envisioned for herself and her children, often brushed off these signs. She believed in the bond she and Stephen shared. She believed the challenges of balancing career and family were temporary. Yet, beneath her smile, the pressures of managing both a demanding professional life and a nurturing household were immense. Every decision carried weight. Every misstep, however small, felt consequential. Friends and coworkers would later describe her as both magnetic and disciplined. She had an innate ability to make others feel seen. At the same time, she was resolute, rarely bending under pressure. Her ambition inspired admiration. Her kindness, deep respect. And yet, these very qualities, the independence, the drive, the unyielding commitment to her children, were also the source of silent tension in her marriage. Because what no one outside the home could see, what the neighbors could never know, was that these strengths, her very essence, would unknowingly create a fault line. A fault line that would split the life she had built. And in the shadows of her suburban dream, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would shatter the delicate balance she had worked so hard to maintain. Stephen Grant had settled into the rhythm of being a stay-at-home father. On the surface, his life was ordinary. He prepared breakfasts, drove the children to school, managed errands and household chores. But beneath this seemingly mundane routine, a quiet unease was growing. To friends, he spoke often of Tara's absences. "She's never around," he would say. "Always at work, always traveling." At first, these were just passing remarks, complaints shared over coffee or a friendly visit. But the more he repeated them, the more they revealed something deeper, an envy that was starting to fester. Stephen's resentment grew as Tara's career continued to flourish. He watched as she gained promotions, traveled for work, and earned the respect of her colleagues. Meanwhile, he remained at home, performing the duties of family life that often go unnoticed. Each evening, when Tara returned from work, she brought with her the reminders of a life Stephen could not touch: independence, ambition, recognition. Soon, his frustrations began to turn into scrutiny. He would ask about every late-night email, question every phone call, wonder aloud about her meetings. Each question seemed casual, even caring. But to anyone paying attention, a pattern was emerging, an obsession with monitoring her life. He began to track her movements, noting what she did, when she left, when she returned. Even the smallest details did not escape him. A forgotten lunch, a delayed phone call, a conversation with a coworker, these small moments, normal for most couples, began to fuel his anger. Friends recalled that Stephen sometimes lingered on topics for far too long, repeatedly returning to the same complaints, each time with increasing intensity.
To argue. He had told her, this has to stop. You're gone all the time.
It wasn't just curiosity. It was control. What started as suspicion had grown into something far more consuming. Stephen's thoughts were dominated by Tara's schedule, her choices, her interactions. Every success she celebrated felt to him like a personal slight. Every opportunity she seized highlighted the life he felt slipping away from his grasp. By early 2007, the shift was undeniable. His jealousy, once subtle, had evolved. It no longer resembled mere concern or insecurity. It had transformed into obsession. A dangerous, unrelenting fixation that would soon spill over into actions no one in the neighborhood could have anticipated. The storm brewing behind closed doors was ready to break, and its impact would be devastating. The evening of February 9, 2007, began like any other for Tara Lynn Grant. She returned home from a work trip, her briefcase slung over one shoulder, her suitcase following close behind. The weight of travel tugged at her shoulders, but she moved with a quiet resolve. There was a rhythm to her steps, tired, yes, but purposeful. She had 2 children waiting, a home to settle back into, and a life she had built with care. Her coworkers would later remember her energy that day. Tired but eager to get home, they said. She spoke with a smile, even while discussing deadlines and meetings. The world outside the house knew Tara as competent, ambitious, and warm. And she carried that same energy across the threshold of her home that evening, unaware that the ordinary act of returning would soon become a pivot point in her life. Inside the Grant household, the children were playing quietly, laughter floating down the hallway in scattered bursts. The television played softly in the background. Stephen moved through the rooms, performing routine chores, a faint tension visible in the way he walked, the way he glanced toward the front door as if measuring something unseen. Tara set her suitcase down by the entryway, still packed, still waiting for attention. It was a simple, mundane action. But in retrospect, it became ominous. She hung up her coat, exchanged a few words with Stephen, asking about the children's day. He responded, calm but clipped. There was no argument, no overt confrontation. Yet something imperceptible lingered, a subtle dissonance that would later be interpreted as a foreshadowing of the horror to come. Tara moved to the kitchen, unpacking a few personal items from her briefcase. A notebook, a pen, a few papers from her trip. She hummed softly, a sound that carried warmth and domestic familiarity. She checked her phone, responding to messages from her family and colleagues, unaware of the weight of scrutiny falling on her every move. Stephen observed quietly from across the room. A slight frown crossed his face when he noticed the items she unpacked or the messages she answered. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. But it reflected a growing fixation, a tension simmering beneath his composed exterior. What appeared normal, a wife returning from work, a husband assisting in household tasks, was slowly becoming a stage for something darker. Tara took a deep breath, settled her belongings, and walked toward the living room. The children ran to her, hugging her legs, asking about her trip. She laughed softly, crouching to meet them eye to eye, ruffling their hair. The warmth was real. The love was genuine. Yet, in that very room, the atmosphere carried an unspoken unease, a tension that was subtle, invisible, but growing. And then she left her suitcase by the door. Just there. Waiting. Innocuous. But it would become the last ordinary object associated with her. The last trace of Tara Lynn Grant before she disappeared into the shadows of that night. That suitcase would bear silent witness to the events that no one could have predicted. It would remain, untouched, a haunting reminder of a life suddenly stolen. The night settled over the Grant home, quiet but charged. The air was heavy with normalcy, the kind of normalcy that hides secrets, that shields truths only to reveal them in time. And as the clock ticked on that evening, no one knew that the night was about to erupt into chaos. A life of ambition, warmth, and love was about to be abruptly cut short, leaving a family, a community, and a world stunned. The morning after Tara Lynn Grant returned home, a growing unease began to ripple through her family. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left without reply. Initially, it was easy to assume she had overslept, been delayed, or was wrapped up in work. But as hours stretched into the day, the worry became impossible to ignore. Her sister, in particular, grew increasingly alarmed. She called repeatedly, each attempt more desperate than the last. "Tara, please call me back. Just let me know you're okay," she begged in voicemail after voicemail. The anxiety in her voice was unmistakable, a rising tide that reflected the fear gripping the family. Friends too joined the search for reassurance, sending texts, emails, and checking in repeatedly. Stephen Grant contacted the police to file a missing person report. At first glance, it appeared to be a responsible act. Yet those who later recounted the events noted a troubling detail. Stephen appeared unusually composed. Calm. Measured. He downplayed the urgency of Tara's absence, emphasizing that she had traveled often for work, that she might have stayed with colleagues, or been delayed. The tone was deliberate. Too controlled. Too precise. It created a narrative of normalcy in the midst of a growing crisis. Detectives arrived at the Grant residence to investigate. They were presented with a household that looked undisturbed. The home was orderly, rooms untouched, and signs of struggle were absent. Her children were inside, seemingly unaware of the growing alarm outside. The normalcy only amplified the unease. Detectives were faced with a blank slate. Where was Tara? Why had she vanished without a trace? Investigators began methodically collecting information. They spoke with coworkers, neighbors, and family members. Phone records were requested, messages and schedules scrutinized. Every lead was examined, every detail logged. Yet, despite the growing list of contacts and inquiries, nothing led to a concrete answer. No sightings. No threats. No evidence pointing to what had transpired the night before. As the hours passed, the family's anxiety intensified. Friends and relatives waited by phones, hoping for a call that never came. Stephen's calm exterior masked an undercurrent of tension that some later described as unsettling. The detectives, meanwhile, felt the weight of the case. A mother was missing, her children's lives hanging in a fragile balance, and still, no tangible clues emerged. By the end of the first day, the picture was grim. A mother was gone. Her family was desperate. And the investigators had no leads to follow. The quiet suburban home, once a symbol of safety and normalcy, now felt like a cage holding questions that demanded answers. Detectives now had a missing mother, but no real leads. And as night fell over Macomb County, the tension lingered like a shadow, thick and unrelenting, foreshadowing the dark path that would soon unfold. As the hours turned into the second day of the investigation, detectives focused on Stephen Grant, the man who had been closest to Tara Lynn Grant. His story was the first thread they would pull, the key to understanding what had happened, or so it seemed. Stephen spoke with an unsettling calm. He claimed that Tara had left the house after a domestic argument. According to him, the disagreement had been brief but heated. Tara, frustrated and angry, had supposedly stormed out, leaving no indication of when she might return. He spoke in measured sentences, every word carefully chosen. There was no panic in his voice, no tremor of fear, just a simple account of a woman walking out in anger. Detectives immediately noted the oddness of his demeanor. How could a man whose wife had vanished be so composed? Was this the calm of a concerned husband, or the precision of someone hiding something far darker? The question hung in the air, unanswered but palpable. Investigators began to verify Stephen's story. Phone records were pulled. Messages, timestamps, and call logs were carefully examined. And almost immediately, contradictions emerged. The timing of calls did not match the timeline he provided. Locations did not align. Details he had recounted to friends conflicted with his statements to police. Each small discrepancy was a warning flag, a crack in a story that otherwise seemed airtight. Meanwhile, detectives spoke with Tara's coworkers. They described her as professional, focused, and calm during her return from the trip. None of them reported hearing about any argument or tension with Stephen. Friends and neighbors echoed the same. Nothing in Tara's demeanor suggested she would vanish in anger. Each statement further highlighted the inconsistencies in Stephen's narrative. Even casual observations added to the growing suspicion. Tara's suitcase remained by the door, untouched. Her children's routines continued, oblivious to the supposed confrontation. The home, orderly and quiet, told a different story than the one Stephen had described. Investigators began to see that what appeared normal on the surface was hiding deeper truths. By the end of these initial interviews, detectives were certain of one thing: Stephen's account could not be taken at face value. The calmness he exuded, the precision of his words, and the contradictions in his story all pointed to deception. Every question asked revealed another subtle inconsistency. And while the public narrative suggested a woman who had left after a fight, the evidence whispered a darker possibility. The detectives sensed it even then. The calm story, the polished explanation, the controlled tone. This was just the beginning of his lies. And behind those lies, a truth waited. A truth that would soon unravel in ways no one in Macomb County could have imagined. As Tara Lynn Grant remained missing, Stephen Grant stepped into the public eye. He appeared on television, holding his emotions close yet letting just enough slip to seem heartbroken. His words were carefully crafted, pleas for his wife's safe return, appeals to the public, to neighbors, to anyone who might have seen her. His voice wavered, his hands moved slowly, almost rehearsed.
Unless call someone. If you see her, tell me.
And he painted a picture of desperation. To the audience at home, he appeared every bit the grieving husband, the loving father. Yet, for those trained to read human behavior, the cracks were already showing. Body language experts later pointed to subtle inconsistencies. A flicker of a smirk when he thought the camera had shifted. A brief hesitation before answering a question. The way he tilted his head, ever so slightly, or clasped his hands in a controlled manner. Every movement, every gesture was a signal, a hidden layer beneath the public performance. Detectives, meanwhile, were dissecting his story with a fine-tooth comb. They compared his public statements to what he had told them privately, to the timelines derived from phone records, work schedules, and witness accounts. Each discrepancy was noted. Each pause, each gesture, each minor contradiction became a piece of the puzzle. On the surface, Stephen's narrative told one story. Behind closed doors, evidence suggested another. Neighbors and friends continued to watch, captivated by the image of a man pleading for his missing wife. Yet investigators understood that public perception could be manipulated, that grief could be faked or exaggerated. Every TV interview became material for analysis. Every emotional outburst, every tear shed, was catalogued, timed, and compared against facts. And then, quietly, the house began to speak. Small, almost imperceptible details started to surface. A closet slightly disheveled. A drawer partially open. A kitchen counter with items shifted from their usual places. These were subtle clues, easily overlooked by anyone but telling to those trained to notice them. The home, once a place of ordinary life, began to betray the story Stephen told the world. Detectives documented each anomaly. Each out-of-place object became a marker of suspicion. They noticed patterns, areas of the home where Tara's presence should have been felt, but were eerily devoid of signs. Items she would have used, left untouched. and in contrast, spaces where Stephen's activity suggested hurried or unusual movement. The very walls of the house seemed to hint at a secret that words alone could not reveal. Publicly, Stephen continued to perform grief. Privately, detectives were building a timeline of his actions, his inconsistencies, and his potential involvement. His image of vulnerability and concern clashed with the growing reality of the investigation. And as the detectives delved deeper, they realized that the home, the place that had been a sanctuary, a backdrop to ordinary life, was beginning to tell the story that Stephen's words could not. The house itself was revealing its secrets. And soon, those secrets would become impossible to ignore. The investigation was gaining momentum. Detectives, armed with evidence bags, flashlights, and a growing sense of unease, began a thorough search of the Grant residence. Every room, every closet, every surface was methodically examined. What had once appeared to be an ordinary suburban home was now a puzzle of hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. It was in the garage that the first undeniable evidence emerged. Small, irregular spots of blood marred the concrete floor, almost imperceptible at first glance, but unmistakable upon closer inspection. The odor was faint yet distinct, a subtle but disturbing sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators crouched over the spots, photographing, swabbing, and carefully cataloging each trace. The garage, a space meant for cars and mundane storage, had become a silent witness to a crime beyond imagination. Stephen Grant was immediately confronted. He offered an explanation. The blood, he claimed, came from an animal he had hunted. But the story did not hold up. Neighbors and friends confirmed he did not hunt. There were no firearms in the house, no hunting trips, no evidence to support his narrative. Each word he spoke seemed rehearsed, polished, and increasingly at odds with the evidence before the detectives' eyes. Detectives expanded their search, combing the garage and adjacent areas. They noticed subtle signs of disturbance, footprints smudged across concrete, scuff marks near the workbench, and an almost imperceptible trail of residue leading toward the side door. Every small detail painted a chilling picture, one that spoke louder than Stephen's carefully crafted explanations. The family home, once a symbol of normalcy, now revealed itself as a stage for deception. Each clue, each inconsistency, pushed investigators further into the realization that the suburban facade was hiding a darkness they were only beginning to understand. Even as the first physical evidence was documented, detectives sensed there was far more to uncover. The small spots of blood were not just traces, they were an ominous foreshadowing of what lay ahead. Each swab, each photograph, each piece of the puzzle intensified the tension. Stephen maintained his composure in public, but behind closed doors, the detective's observations and growing list of contradictions painted a different story. The pieces were slowly aligning, but the full picture remained elusive. The evidence was mounting, yet the worst, the most horrifying discovery, was still out of sight, waiting to shatter the illusion completely. The tension was palpable. Every breath in the garage felt heavy with the unspoken reality. The answers were close, and the truth would soon reveal itself in the most shocking way. The evidence was mounting, but the worst discovery was still ahead. The garage was silent except for the muffled sounds of investigators moving carefully across the concrete floor. Every step felt like walking through a nightmare. Detectives approached the freezer, gloved hands trembling slightly despite years of experience. The appliance, once ordinary and unremarkable, now loomed like a harbinger of horror. With deliberate caution, the freezer door was lifted. The first wave of the metallic, pungent odor hit immediately, a smell that made seasoned officers pause, cover their noses, and exchange grim, unspoken glances. Inside, carefully wrapped and concealed, were the dismembered remains of Tara Lynn Grant. Time seemed to slow. The discovery was a moment none of them would ever forget. Even officers who had witnessed violent crimes before were visibly shaken. One leaned against the wall for support. Another silently took notes, hands shaking. Faces went pale, breaths became shallow. The reality of what had been hidden in plain sight, in the home of a loving father and husband, crashed down like a hammer. The chilling magnitude of the crime became clear. Stephen Grant, the man who had won public sympathy with his televised pleas for his wife's return, had been living under the same roof with his children, mere feet from the freezer that held her remains. The ordinary suburban home, the heart of a family's daily life, had masked a nightmare. The normalcy, the laughter, the routines, all of it was a facade that hid unspeakable evil. Detectives worked swiftly, meticulously documenting every detail. Photographs, swabs, evidence bags filled with fragments, each small piece a step closer to understanding the crime. The freezer, once an unremarkable household appliance, had become the focal point of one of Michigan's most shocking domestic murders. The investigation's momentum intensified. Stephen's public image, a grieving father and husband, collided violently with the reality revealed in the garage. The community's shock would soon follow, but first, the law had to act. Officers moved to secure the home, coordinate with local and state authorities, and prepare for the arrest of the man now undeniably implicated. But then came an even more confounding twist. As authorities prepared to apprehend him, Stephen Grant disappeared. There was no note, no warning, no trace of where he might have gone. The man responsible for a chilling betrayal, living alongside his children while hiding a wife's remains mere feet away, had vanished. The predator had melted into the shadows, leaving investigators, neighbors, and the entire community in stunned disbelief. The first major climax of the case was undeniable. The truth about Tara Lynn Grant's death had been revealed in the most horrifying way imaginable. Yet instead of facing justice, Stephen had disappeared. The pursuit would be relentless, the stakes unimaginable, and the nightmare far from over. The evidence was mounting, but the worst discovery was still ahead. The moment detectives secured the evidence in the Grant garage, Stephen Grant vanished. He disappeared into the shadowed woods behind the family home, barefoot, leaving behind only a trail of snow-laden footprints. The biting Michigan winter offered no mercy. Every flake of falling snow seemed to erase the evidence of his flight, but it could not erase the terror that spread through the town. Locals who caught glimpses of him described a figure moving with desperate urgency, hunched, frantic, and unprepared for the freezing cold. Children playing outside ran indoors as the figure darted between trees. Neighbors called in sightings, each report escalating the tension. The man who had been the pillar of a family now became a phantom of fear in their midst. Law enforcement sprang into action. Officers fanned out across the dense woods, flashlights cutting through the twilight. Search dogs sniffed the frozen underbrush, noses quivering, while officers called his name into the silent, wind-whipped forest. Every hour that passed without capture increased the stakes. The fugitive could be anywhere, hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. Meanwhile, the story erupted into the national spotlight. News vans flooded the quiet streets, cameras capturing the stunned faces of neighbors and the family home now swarming with law enforcement. Television networks replayed Stephen's earlier interviews, juxtaposed with the gruesome discovery of Tara's remains. Headlines screamed of betrayal, murder, and a killer husband on the run. Public fascination and fear intertwined, as viewers from across the nation followed the hunt in real time. The town itself became a cage of tension and dread. Parents kept children indoors, windows were shuttered, and neighbors moved cautiously through streets that once felt safe. The question haunted every conversation: where was Stephen hiding? How could someone so close to the scene vanish so completely, leaving a town paralyzed with fear? Every day of his flight intensified the suspense. Residents watched every shadow, every movement through the trees, knowing the man responsible for unimaginable violence had once lived among them as a seemingly normal father and husband. Every unconfirmed sighting renewed panic. Every false lead frayed nerves. The search pressed on for nearly a week. Each dawn brought renewed hope of capture. Each night brought the chilling reminder that he was still out there. The manhunt was not just for justice, but for the restoration of peace in a community traumatized by betrayal and violence. For nearly a week, the town lived in fear. Where was he hiding? What lengths would he go to avoid facing the consequences of his crimes? And in the shadows of the forest, was he watching the town he had terrorized, biding his time? The icy woods of Michigan became the stage for a chilling pursuit. Stephen Grant had disappeared into the forest behind his home, leaving behind only faint footprints pressed into the snow. Each step the search teams took was deliberate, careful, as if the forest itself could betray their movements. Helicopters hovered overhead, their powerful beams of light cutting across the shadowed trees, illuminating the labyrinth of white that seemed endless and unforgiving. Search dogs strained against their handlers, noses working tirelessly to detect any trace of the fugitive. Officers scanned the underbrush and snow-covered hollows, calling out his name into the void, their voices swallowed by the wind. The cold was relentless. Frostbite nipped at fingers and faces, yet no one wavered. The urgency of finding a killer father and husband propelled them forward. Stephen survived in the harsh conditions through sheer desperation. Reports later revealed he scavenged for food by eating snow and occasionally breaking into abandoned sheds and outbuildings to hide from detection. His movements were calculated but frantic, designed to keep him just out of reach. Every sighting by locals heightened the tension. The man who had once walked among them as a seemingly ordinary neighbor had become a predator stalking the shadows. News outlets descended upon the town, transforming a small, quiet community into a national spectacle. Television crews broadcast live from the edge of the woods. Footage replayed Stephen's earlier televised interviews, now cast in a chilling new light. Headlines screamed, "Killer husband on the run." Public fascination merged with horror as viewers across the country tracked every update, every hint of his trail. For nearly a week, the town existed under a cloud of fear. Parents kept children indoors, neighbors patrolled their streets cautiously, and every shadow in the snow became a potential threat. Each day of the manhunt intensified the suspense. Officers examined broken branches, disturbed snow, and other subtle signs. Every detail a clue, every misstep a potential breakthrough. Then, after days of relentless searching, a breakthrough occurred. Stephen Grant was found hiding in a dilapidated shed on the outskirts of the woods, gaunt, pale, and visibly altered. The man who had once appeared confident and composed on television now emerged as someone almost unrecognizable. His eyes were hollow, his movements frail. The desperation, isolation, and the weight of his crimes had stripped him down to a shadow of the man the public thought they knew. The manhunt had reached its peak. Stephen Grant was in custody, but the weight of his actions, the horror of Tara Lynn Grant's murder, and the betrayal that had unfolded so close to home would linger in the hearts and minds of the town long after the snow had melted. The fugitive was finally captured. Justice, at least partially, could begin. When they finally caught him, Stephen wasn't the same man they'd seen on TV. The chase through Michigan's icy wilderness ended abruptly. Stephen Grant collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, shivering uncontrollably, his body succumbing to the bitter cold. Frostbite had already begun to claim fingers and toes, while his lungs burned with each ragged breath. The man who had once projected control and confidence was now broken, defeated, a shadow of his former self. Officers approached cautiously, unsure whether he was dangerous or simply delirious from exposure. Stephen's eyes darted nervously, and he mumbled fragments of incoherent sentences, swinging between anger and despair. One moment, he accused the officers of ruining his life. The next, he whispered Tara's name, as if seeking some twisted absolution for what he had done. His voice cracked under the weight of his emotions, and the contrast between the public persona and the man before them was chilling. Even as he was assisted to his feet, he resisted subtly, swaying unsteadily, muttering about betrayal and injustice. Officers noted the erratic behavior, a man grappling not only with the physical strain of survival but also with a mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The decision was immediate. Stephen needed medical attention before any questioning could begin. Paramedics arrived, carefully layering blankets over his frost-bitten body, administering warm fluids, and monitoring his vital signs. Every gesture, every twitch, every fragmented sentence hinted at the complex and disturbed mind of a man who had lived a double life, a man who had murdered his wife and concealed it behind the veneer of suburban normalcy. Transported to the hospital, Stephen's presence sent ripples through the investigative team. Detectives observed from a distance as he underwent treatment, noting his fluctuating mood, his incoherent rambling, and moments of sudden lucidity. In the quiet, sterile hospital corridors, it was as if the full weight of his actions pressed down upon him. And yet, despite his capture, the true story had only just begun to unravel. Questions remained. How could a man who lived among his family commit such a heinous crime? How long had he been capable of hiding darkness behind a seemingly ordinary life? The town could finally breathe, but the secrets of the Grant household were still locked within Stephen's fractured mind. The walls of deception were beginning to crumble, and what he would reveal next would shock everyone. And that's when his story began to shift again. Once Stephen Grant was secured, the truth of Tara Lynn Grant's murder began to emerge in chilling layers. Initially, he tried to portray himself as the victim. "She attacked me first," he claimed to investigators, his voice steady yet hollow. He painted a picture of chaos, of a struggle spiraling out of control, a desperate man forced into self-defense. But the evidence told a story Stephen could not control. Forensic experts meticulously examined the remains, noting the surgical precision of the dismemberment. Each cut was deliberate, calculated, a methodical process far removed from the frenzied attack he described. Investigators found no signs of defensive wounds on Stephen that could match his claims. Every piece of evidence contradicted his narrative, highlighting not only the brutality of the crime but the careful planning behind it. In the courtroom, the prosecution dismantled his shifting confessions with methodical precision. They presented photos, forensic analysis, and timelines that stripped away the layers of deception. Every attempt Stephen made to justify his actions was met with undeniable facts. The contrast between his calm, manipulative tone and the horrifying reality of his actions was stark. The emotional intensity of the trial reached its peak when Tara's family testified. Her parents described the void left by her disappearance, the empty bed, the unanswered calls, the shattered routines of a life interrupted. Siblings recounted holidays without her laughter, the birthdays she would never celebrate, and the trauma left behind for her children. Each testimony drew a visceral response from the courtroom. Even seasoned officers and jurors found themselves shaken, reminded that behind every forensic detail lay a human tragedy of immense scale. Stephen sat in the defendant's chair, face pale, eyes flickering between shame, anger, and a feigned detachment. Yet even his bravado faltered as the prosecution methodically exposed the contradictions in his confessions. He attempted to argue that his actions were reactive, the result of a moment of panic, but the meticulously documented evidence left no room for doubt. The courtroom was heavy with grief, tension, and anticipation. The jury listened intently, absorbing the weight of the evidence and the emotional testimony of Tara's family. Each piece of information, each detail of Stephen's deception, slowly constructed a narrative that left no ambiguity. This was not self-defense. This was premeditated betrayal and murder, carried out by the man who had sworn to protect and love. And then came the silence before closing arguments, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. The jury would soon deliberate. The fate of Stephen Grant, a man who had committed unspeakable acts behind the veneer of a suburban life, rested entirely in their hands. The trial had revealed the full horror of his actions, but the final judgment was still to come. The jury would soon decide his fate. The courtroom finally delivered its verdict. Stephen Grant was convicted of second-degree murder. The weight of the evidence, the meticulous planning, and the haunting testimony of Tara's family left no room for doubt. Justice had been served, at least in the legal sense. Experts later described the case as a classic example of control, resentment, and rage. A marriage that had appeared ordinary from the outside concealed a simmering darkness, a volatile mix of jealousy, frustration, and the desire for dominance. Stephen's actions were methodical, calculated, and chilling in their precision. Tara Lynn Grant's legacy, however, could not be overshadowed by her husband's crimes. Colleagues remembered her ambition, her dedication, and her warmth. Neighbors recalled a mother who balanced career and family with grace, who offered kindness without expectation. Tara's life, though cut tragically short, left a mark that continues to resonate in the hearts of those who loved her. Yet the story did not end quietly. From prison, Stephen continued to appeal, showing little to no remorse for the destruction he had caused. His actions left a lingering unease. A man capable of orchestrating such horror, now confined behind bars, yet still attempting to manipulate the narrative of his life. For Tara's family, the story ended in tragedy. For Stephen, it was the life he chose, a life defined by betrayal and destruction. Do you think Stephen's sentence was enough for what he did to Tara? Share your thoughts below. And while this chapter closes, the world of true crime continues to reveal stories of deception, double lives, and the tragic cost of misplaced trust. Next time, we'll uncover another chilling story of betrayal and tragedy. Before you go, if you found this story compelling, insightful, or important, please like this video, share it with someone who cares about true crime awareness, and subscribe for more in-depth, narrative-driven documentaries. Your support helps these stories reach more people, honor the victims, and keep their memories alive.